So welcome to all of you, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online on the live stream. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the weekend, Ashwin. So please give him a warm welcome. I'm sure he's going to have an excellent talk for us.
Hi folks, morning to those I've not greeted yet, morning. So Naomi and I realized that this thing was rather high last night, so we are doing things differently. Okay. You perhaps just gonna...
You might just need to press it.
Okay. Usually I'm too short for these type of things. Oh. Okay. You know, the thing with technology is the moment you need it most, it sort of does this thing where it forgets about you. So now my laptop is showing a blank screen. Let me just do this first. Okay. Here we go. Welcome. Okay, so I'm going to hope that it displays, and I'm hoping that my head isn't in the way. Welcome. So today we'll be focusing on the theme pursuing the good, and perhaps it would just be wise to do an outline of what I perceive to be some form of a logic to our discussions in the next day and a half. So yesterday we had a discussion or a reflection on People of the Way, that was the title, and this offered a reflection on the message of the earliest followers of Jesus, those who the book of the Acts of the Apostles calls the followers of the way. And we briefly touched on how I imagine that Mary's song in Luke 1 must have been sort of a formative lullaby for Jesus and his ministry and his work, and that was to some degree, the inspiration that informs the earliest followers of Jesus. So today, right now, we'll be focusing on the theme pursuing the good, and then later on in the day, we'll be walking in humility, or we'll be walking humbly. And I might just push that in a very different direction than what would be anticipated. And then tomorrow, we will be focusing on the question, where do we go from here? So let's get into the meat of today. In the book of Micah, we find these words that the theme of our gathering draws on. And these words are, God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? God has told you, O mortal, O human, what is good. And so goodness is what we are trying to think about today, what we are trying to reflect on today, and what we are trying to walk into a more good existence. So, as you are aware, I'm from South Africa, and we have a bad reputation for the lack of human dignity, the lack of recognizing people's shared humanity. I need not remind you, but perhaps I should just in brief say the South African project as we know it as a nation state, political system started in around 1652 on the 6th of April with the arrival of the Dutch at the Cape, in Cape Town, which was supposed to be a halfway station to the Americas for the Dutch who were transporting enslaved people. And within time, so this is the Dutch East India Company who had transported slaves. And within time, they realized that this is more than just a halfway station. This is actually a place for territorial settlement. And then as a result, expansion happened at the Cape, and soon the Dutch settlers then, well, they settled. They entered the Cape, and then they violently, of course, took land from the people that were the indigenous people of the country. And so you have sort of this reality that plays out in the 1600s and early 1700s. And then, of course, in time, you have the arrival of your kinfolk, the British, who then come as a colonial power, and they then have wars with the Dutch about who can actually claim the territory of South Africa. And then, because of these continued wars, and also there was, well, battles between the indigenous people as well. And then by the year 1910, South Africa becomes a union as part of the British Union. And then by 1948, we then have the election to power of the apartheid government, the Afrikaner government that sought quite palpably segregation of a different kind. I always say apartheid is, for me, segregation on steroids. It forcibly separated South Africa. So this then is the history of our nation state. And so by the time 1994 comes along, we then elect our first democratic government. And so as of 1994, South Africa, well, as of the early 90s, since then, South Africa has had to think, many of us, especially those of us who have a religious affinity, have had to think critically about what it means to exist in a society that is as divided as it is, what it means to create a society and co-create a society in which we center the value of human dignity. So foundational to our Constitution then are these three values: human dignity, freedom, and equality. And so one of my colleagues now, Professor Nico Koopman, has the following to say about human dignity. He says we have dignity because we are created in God's image. We have dignity because God became human in Jesus Christ and redeems us. We have dignity because the Holy Spirit, as God at work in the world, is actualizing in and through us the new humanity that is a reality in Jesus Christ. So he makes this fundamental point that we as humans have inherent dignity. He continues with these words: true humanity is, and here we should distinguish. So again, because I'm an African, much of African philosophy draws on this idea of communal living, which is rather different from, who wrote Cogito Ergo Sum now? I can't remember his name. I think Therefore I Am. Yes. Thank you. So it's rather different. My existence, so Cogito, I think Therefore I Am sort of places the subject, the knower, as a subject. And it's a rather individualizing system of thought, whereas African traditional religion and African philosophy would endorse a different alternative, saying, we are, therefore I am. So my existence, my subjectivity is predicated on the fact that I am in community, I am in relation with others. And so fleshing this out a bit more intensely, Koopman continues and says, and I quote, true humanity is not defined by independence and rationality, but by the willingness to enter into relationships with others. In this relationship with the other, one does not encounter a replica of oneself. In the interactions with others, in the relationship, I find my essence, my being. I receive my being from the others. We receive our existence from the hands of the other, and my existence is meaningful because there are others who want to share their existence with me. And I'll repeat that final sentence. We receive our existence from the hands of the other, and my existence is meaningful, perhaps blessed, because there are others who want to share their existence with me. So principally, there is this idea that our existence is a gift, it is a grace. And the moment we enter into relationship with others, as we have fellowship with each other, we gift each other our shared humanity, but also we affirm the humanity of each other. So, now I'm saying a lot about humanity and dignity and human dignity, but I do want to caution one very important thing, and I think at this stage we have a lot of work to do as humans, as people, regarding the fact that we are living within the Anthropocene. Our focus on humanity should be a very responsible one, recognizing the damages and the catastrophes we are causing throughout the environment. And so, whenever we do encounter those words, which many are oft to quote in the book of Genesis, Genesis 1:26, to rule and to command the earth, I've always opted for a very different interpretation and translation, to rather say, perhaps our work is to care and to steward for the earth. And so, while we are intentionally affirming the dignities of each other, of the other, of an other, we need to do so quite responsibly. And so I would like to raise this question. So what do you think is the good that God is calling you to do? What is the good? And if you are so comfortable, I would like those of us in the room to share sort of the good that you feel that God is pressing upon your heart at this stage in your life, that you are called to do, to invest your time in. Anyone? We have a bit of minutes, so please think about it. Anyone? Yes?
At the moment, I feel like the good I'm called to is trying to commit to a prayerful life in a very sort of conscious way. So making the time for prayer in a structured.
So I'm just going to repeat that for the folks who are joining us. You are trying to commit to a prayer life that is intentional, conscious, and that has some form of structure. That is the good that God is calling you to do right now. Anyone else? Yes.
Okay, and God's calling me to speak out against injustice and to speak truth to power.
Call to speak out against injustice and to speak truth to power.
I think I'm being called to be joyful.
Call to be joyful. Quite love that. Yes.
To create communities in the places I go, and like facilitate conversation and friendship and community.
Create community, facilitate conversation, and invest time in friendship.
To study more deeply theology so that I can then there's a lot, like I want to speak to people who maybe don't understand the experiences of marginalised groups, but I found that I am hampered by my lack of just general basic theological knowledge because I've never studied it in any way, and I'm feeling at the moment quite called to go and learn more so that I can make more sense and bring change in a way that actually makes theological sense, as well as just this is what I think should be happening.
So call to study theology in order to make more sense for those who have a yearning to hear an alternative.
Yeah.
Well, those who are oppressed, who are yearning for an alternative.
Speak to those in more powerful situations and maybe don't realise that there could be an alternative theologically to what they've decided, which oppresses people.
Yeah. Thank you.
I know there is one, I just haven't worked out what it is yet. That's possible.
Thank you. Anyone else? One final one?
I feel I'm called to be a bridge to help different people understand and help groups work together.
Okay, call to be a bridge to help people understand. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing, and for those of you who have not shared but thought about the question, thank you so much. God has told you, O mortal, O human, what is good. So, as has been mentioned yesterday evening, I am from the Global South. I'm so from the Global South, my country's name is South Africa. and I've told you about the history of South Africa now, and I mean, you know, the history of Africa and the history of countries from the Global South in general. There's this hankering for forms of human living that are, well, forms of living, not just human living, but forms of living that are more just, that are liberatory. And so in the next few minutes, I want us to think together about goodness as liberation, to think about goodness as being set free from bondage, being set free from oppression. To think about goodness as not just having a voice, because we all have a voice. If there's one thing I want to say right now, please, this is now off script, but please, we need to be more intentional about, we shouldn't give people voices. Our job as activists is to pass the mic. People have voices. We are the ones who might be holding the mic, but our job is to literally pass the mic to those people for them to speak on their own terms. Even if the language might be a bit illegible, our job oftentimes might be as interpreters, but it's not to give people voices. We are mic passers. So I want us to think about goodness, the goodness that God calls us to, you know, the goodness to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. That goodness, that maybe that goodness is the work of liberation. And so I'm drawing on the doctoral work of my colleague where I work. She wrote, her PhD was titled Imagining Human Flourishing, a Systematic Theological Exploration of Contemporary Soteriological Discourses. Now, that's a mouthful, and for the theologians in the room, it's quite deep and lovely and nuanced, and I would gladly recommend you to read it, because what she does in a very interesting way is she draws various theologians in conversation with each other across the geographical divide, across the various denominational divides, but quite simply, she wants us to think about human flourishing as a gift of God. And how might we co-create a world in which human flourishing is not only possible, but enabled? And so she draws on theology to do that. So let's go into this. So now I'm from the Global South. And so the first theologian we'll be looking at, because I'm only listing three, who intentionally think about salvation, who think about redemption as human flourishing, as liberation. And the first one we'll be thinking about, the first one I'm mentioning now is the Latin American Peruvian theologian, Gustavo Gutierrez. And if I'm not mistaken, he turned about 96 or 95 a few weeks ago. And so he's a Catholic theologian from Latin America, and he finished his studies in around the 1960s, and of course at that time Peru was not exactly peaceful, and so he thought very intensely about economic divides between, well, not only him, but many of his colleagues, many of the Catholic theologians at the time in Latin America more generally, thought about the economic divides between the rich and the poor, who thought intentionally about the fact that governments are abusing people, that are creating human rights violations or causing human rights violations. And so he offered an alternative to the more conventional, traditional form of theology, which usually, oftentimes, our theological ideas align with those who are in power. And this is a very global phenomenon. as soon as a church rises to power, well, as soon as a church enjoys benefits from a particular nation state government, they start acting in ways that aren't too favorable to people in general. And so Gutierrez argues for an alternative understanding of what it firstly means to be human, what it means to be a Christian, and what it means to be church. And so he has this entire idea that salvation or liberation is in community. To be redeemed does require that one places oneself within community. And so that requires a particular sense of solidarity. It requires a particular sense or a particular commitment to being an ally. It requires a devotion to passing the mic. And so Gutierrez says, fundamentally, at the heart of good Christian theology is the idea that God loves everyone. Definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, God loves us all equally. But as he reads scripture, he finds that throughout the Bible, God has a preferential option for those who are the neglected in society, those who are oppressed by the systems that be, those whose lives are rendered precarious by the systemic machinations of the day. And so he says, because God loves all of us, we have a role, we have a duty, we have a calling to speak to these the powers that be and hold them accountable and say to them that we cannot allow the continued oppression of God's beloved to continue. And so in his theological thinking, in his commitment to the world before him, in his commitment to the gospel, he says that we need to be more intentionally praxis-oriented. It is not enough to just think about the goodness of God, to think about the grace of God. Because of our thinking about the grace of God, we are required to now go and do and become to others the very grace of God. So it is not enough to just sit in our... And this is the thing also my folks, theologians, do greatly well, we do amazingly well, is to sit in the office and write an essay and then think we've solved the issues of the world. If you're a pastor and then fast forward and then what you do even better is to go and preach to the people and say you must go and fix the world, and then get off the pulpit and go to your study and live a very blessed life without realizing that there is work to be done out there. And so Gustavo says, even as much as our thinking is important, fundamentally linked to that is our doing. Because, he says, salvation can only be truly experienced in community, in fellowship. And so he writes that communion with God is inescapably means a Christian life centered around a concrete and creative commitment of service to others. Of service to others. Now, in the previous century, I'm not sure which pope now, but I think it was at the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church decided that, well, not decided, had the very strong commitment to seeing the church as a sacrament, as a sign to the world. And so Gustavo's saying that the work of liberation requires that we commit ourselves to being in relationship, in communion with each other, is also his way of saying we are required as activists, as people of the faith, as people of the way, to be a sign of an alternative, of something different, something radically different. So that's the first person I'm lifting up, the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez. Okay, so then there's a second person, and this is the African theologian who is considered the premier African feminist theologian, Mercy Orioye, and she is quite known for the monumental work she's done across the continent on the centering of women's lives throughout the churches. And much like in many form parts of Europe, we do have a particular, patriarchy is everywhere. Let's not, patriarchy is definitely everywhere. But because of the historical developments in the continent of Africa and because of colonialism, quite honestly, patriarchy plays out in a particular form in Africa where women's voices are still silenced in various church spaces. And so her devotion and her work with alongside other women theologians in centering women's voices is very important at this time, even as there are many progressive shifts being made in Africa. Even so, we do see oftentimes considerable reversals being made. And one example is currently Uganda, where even though there have been quite important shifts in the Ugandan state with regards to gender equality, there is still this reversal of progress with the current anti-homosexuality law or bill. And so Uriel says that we should think about liberation as wholeness. As wholeness. And again, I want to say what I said earlier, because she's African and because of the way the thought system works in Africa, one does not see oneself, one's subjectivity lies not in oneself being an individual, it lies in the fact that one is part of a community. And so wholeness is really this idea that there is no peace unless all of us in community are reconciled with each other. And so this for her is the fundamental, that it requires a commitment to the wholeness of ourselves as individuals, but also the wholeness of our community. And that if there is a squabble, for lack of a better word, between persons in the community, then that stifles the wholeness of the community itself. And so thinking about liberation as wholeness, as goodness as wholeness, she says that we need to be reminded that we are, if we're saying that we're Christian, we do have this idea that we are redeemed from something. We are saved from something. And this thing might have many names. It might be the personality of Satan, of the idea of evil, I told you last night, I still use the word sin. We are saved from sin. We are saved from the unhealthy power structures of our day. These are the things Uriel would say we are saved from. We are saved from queerphobia. We are saved from sexism. We are saved from poverty. These would be the ways in which she would articulate our redemption, our salvation, our liberation. The goodness to which God calls us is not any of these sets of oppressions. But in the same way, as we are being saved from something and some things, we are being redeemed and liberated for things as well. We are liberated and redeemed and saved for the good life, for the work of justice, for the work of mercy, for the work of humility, for life together, for liberation, for living in right relationship with each other. These are the things we are being redeemed for. We are being redeemed to care for the creation. And so, because we are being both saved from something and saved for something, it requires us to recognize the reality of things such as evil. It requires us to recognize the reality of sin. It requires us also to realize that oftentimes we become accomplices to what is wrong in the world. And it requires us to recognize our own culpability in the structures that we have created, the boundaries that we set up oftentimes in our own lives in relationship with others. But even so, because we are redeemed for something, the goodness to which we are redeemed or for which we are redeemed should help us, assist us to not only forgive others, because I oftentimes think that is, even as difficult as it is often easy to do, but also forgive ourselves. and the manifold ways in which we sin, in which we become accomplices and culpable in the patterns of existence that aren't healthy, that aren't dignifying, that does damage, that distorts our relationships. And so she says, one of the most important ways in which we can do that is by telling our stories. It's by witnessing, by saying the good, by mentioning the good to which we have been called. That good might be rejoicing. That good might be being a bridge builder. That good might right now be a more intense study of theology in order to understand and communicate. But that good requires you to know your story, to tell your story, to immerse yourself in the contours of your story, to embrace your story with all of its hurts. Because in doing so, in being faithful to your story, you find a truer form of continuing life. And so Uriah says, and I quote, God is concerned for the wholeness of our being and for our relationship to God and to other human beings. And so the final person I would like to lift up today or right now is my former rector at the university, Professor Russell Botman, who, for those who are going to Berlin at the end of the month, he was also a Bonhoeffer scholar, a Bonhoeffer theologian. And I've mentioned the rise I mentioned the arrival of the Dutch settlers at the Cape, but also the rise of Afrikaner nationalism and the apartheid government. So my institution, my university, was literally started in order to sustain Afrikaner, ethnicity, the ethnicity. The racial group, but they define themselves as a racial group. It was supposed to service the needs of Afrikaner culture. So that's why you needed to provide professionals in order to make sure that your thought systems could continue existing and could continue to separate the country in the manner that you see fit. And so in the early 2000s, quite unexpectedly, he was appointed as the rector of my institution, which was a clear break in the history of the institution for one reason in particular, the fact that he was not a white Afrikaans man. He still happened to be a man, though, but he was not white, and so that made a major difference at an institution such as mine. And he had also, he was a black person in South Africa, so he had also come from rather unfair circumstances, but he was very committed to imagining a South Africa and a world in which reconciliation and justice was at its center. A world in which our race identity marker does not determine the set of circumstances we inherit. A world in which, in fact, gender does not render our lives more precarious than others. And so he's no longer with us, so he saw salvation, redemption, the goodness to which God calls us as a truer understanding of reconciliation with God and reconciliation with our neighbors and creation. And for him, in order to devote ourselves to reconciliation, he said that one thing is very essential, one thing is very important, and that thing is the idea of hope. If we don't devote ourselves to a true form of hope and not a hope that is cheap and vacuous, but a very lived experience of hope, a hope that is found in the muck and mire of human existence, that alone can sustain our commitment to reconciliation. And whenever he spoke about hope and wrote about hope, I'm often drawn to the words of Maya Angelou in the poem, I think it's the poem I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. In that poem, she has a line at the end which says that I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And in a certain sense, Botman was referring to this consistently in his work, that when we think about hope, we need to think about all of those who have gone before us, who have devoted their lives, their work, their energies, who have made numerous and countless sacrifices in service of creating and co-creating a more just world, a truly reconciled world. And so in his fight against apartheid, alongside others, and in his fight against the continued injustices that still play out in South Africa today, he said a more proper sense of, a more fuller understanding of human dignity, and not the anthropocentric one in which we render ourselves more important than the rest of creation, but a more fuller and healthy and constructive understanding of our dignity, because we are created in the image and likeness of God, and because we are tasked to be stewards of creation. That understanding of dignity might just be able to inspire us to be more committed to hope and to devote our energies, our time, our resources often in service of the work of reconciliation that is to be done. And so Botman says, hope is a precondition for sustainable livelihoods, for fighting poverty, for seeking reconciliation and justice, for building stronger communities, and for pursuing the peace in the city. So from Gustavo, we receive this understanding that liberation must be in community. From Mercy, we receive this idea that our liberation requires a commitment to our collective and individual wholeness. And from Botman, we receive this idea that the goodness to which we are called is a commitment to reconciliation. Now, it's been said I'm from the global south, so I should probably end with the quote from Frans Fanon, because I still happen to be a supposedly post-colonial theorist. And Fanon said the following in Wretched of the Earth, and depending on your translation, it translates thusly: each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Now, oftentimes, especially in the circles that I move, the activist circles in which I move in South Africa and on the continent, oftentimes this thing is, Fanon is quoted rightly, and they would say these words, but we fail to read further on what the book says. The book says exactly this, that each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. But it continues by saying, but it requires the acknowledgement that those who have gone before have made their contribution to the struggle for a more just world. And so, and I say this now as the historian, our work ought not be to spit on the contributions of those who have gone before us. Our work, perhaps at this time, is to celebrate the progress, to recognize it, and to affirm the goodness to which they were called to do. Even so, we will hold them accountable, and we will hold them dearly and kindly so. Remember that each of us will make mistakes on the way, but that our job is still to discover our mission and, to the best of our abilities, to fulfill it. Thank you very much. Again, the floor is open for questions. Please feel free. I'm just not sure how we're going to do that. Could we?
I've got a mic on here, so
it's audible. Okay, perfect. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. That was very interesting. You mentioned Gutierrez quite early on, so I was wondering where you would align yourself with like Jesuit liberation theology and ideas like that.
Yeah, so I should have been more clearly. I definitely agree, totally agree. So my doctoral dissertation is focused on Black theology, so that's a bit North America, precisely because of South Africa's history of race relations. But I full-heartedly agree. I would consider myself a liberation theologian. And that also, yesterday I was jesting at the fact that I consider myself a Marxist to some degree, but that is also inspired by liberation theologians' use of Marxist analysis. Thank you.
it's important to say as well, if you have a question but you'd not like to feature on the live stream, then just give me a nod and we can blank the screen as well. So just let me know if that's something you'd like to do.
The alternative would also be that you ask me afterwards.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, I was understandable, right? No.
You've talked about hope in a really persuasive way. So I want to ask, what gives you hope?
Wow. You know what gives me hope? With everything, with the many reversals in the world right now, gosh, that was a very disheartening moment to now say that. With all of that going on, so I'm part of a network in Africa of LGBTI plus people that are working in their various locations, in their various geographic locations, on being recognized by the law. So I mean, so in South Africa, so let me say this. This is not a bit of a story, but this is what gives me hope.
Okay. Yeah.
So in South Africa, of course, we have the recognition that there shouldn't be discrimination against people who are LGBTI plus. So we have protections. I can get married legally. I can get married. I can adopt children. I have what should be normal for everywhere. I have access to those. I have access to those rights. Whereas in the rest of Africa, this of course is not the reality. And so in various locations in Africa, I know people that are working actively simply just to be decriminalized, simply just for homosexuality, bisexuality, or queerness to be decriminalized. And the fact that these people are actively working to create a society in which they can be recognized for who they are, that gives me so much hope. The fact that they're willing to put their lives on the line, the fact that they are considered, or possibly they might be imprisoned to create a world in which they can be themselves, that gives me tremendous hope. And the fact that we are partnering with other people across the globe that are, seeing that this needs to be done, that gives me a great deal of hope. So even though things are horrible, there are these glimmers of hope that one has to latch on in order to sustain us. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll just follow up questions. Do you think that the context of liberation theology is, or the kind of application of liberation theology differs from the South American context to like a Black African or Black North American context? And do you think the Catholic foundation of that is necessary or important when liberation theology is discussed?
I think one major difference plays out is that it's the form of oppression that had happened in, America in particular now, and South Africa. So most African theologians would be very happy with, not that I'm dismissing it, but would find much resonance with liberation theology, because the form of colonization in Africa, in the rest of Africa, besides South Africa and Namibia, was not settler colonialism. Whereas in Namibia and South Africa and America, settler colonialism played out. And so to some degree, we were oppressed because we were Black. And so that requires an intentional wrestling with race dynamics. And so Latin Americans have often not done that. And that is precisely because of their context. And so that is where, in South Africa in particular, we find a lot of resonance with an understanding that race needs to be at the center, because many people are oppressed in South Africa because of their race. And so in that sense, we need to keep though I don't see these two as being in contradiction with each other. I see them as very much in conversation with each other, and we need to advance that conversation. Yes?
Yeah, I find this particular statement that you ended here quite interesting, because I can see how as individuals we might be called to find, discover, ambition, fulfill it, or portray it. But I think there's a real challenge. I don't quite understand what you mean by each generation, because, the sad truth is that in each generation, there are going to be people who feel they're discovering, prayerfully, their mission and seeking to fulfill it, but that mission will be opposite to one another group in that generation of feeling. I mean, we're fairly unified in this group in how we feel about certain issues and what we call social justice, but there will be groups of young people in other environments who will be seeking, will be hearing something else which they consider they're prayerfully receiving.
Yeah,
And that's a challenge, isn't it?
that is the challenge. And I think one of the ways in which I think about, I hate binaries. I genuinely, because I'm a queer theologian, so I genuinely hate binaries, and I don't think we should work with them. But I can't work. I just think there are some forms of some ideas that are life affirming, and there are some ideas that are life denying. And so the challenge is to discern which ideas, which missions are life affirming, and which are life denying. And I think each of us needs to do that as individuals, but also as collective groups to figure out where, and that is the challenge, to sit within the discomfort of discernment and figure out where best do I invest my time and energy. And that will often mean that, and this is a sad thing, so I don't like, I'm a good pastor and I believe the Bible with my whole heart, but I found the Psalms a bit so dismissive because it speaks about enemies. I don't want enemies. Now, of course, I'm saying as an activist, of course, there is an enemy, but I don't want people to be my enemy. I want an idea to be my enemy. But it does require a serious wrestling with why the Psalm speaks about having foes and enemies. And, because we realize that oftentimes the principalities and powers of the realm does take on fleshly form. And we need to hold them accountable. I'm not saying we should hate them, but we need to hold them accountable. And oftentimes there might be folks of our generation which we need to say, hold on, sibling, I think this might not be healthy. And oftentimes that does mean I will be on the receiving end of hearing that word of caution. And so how do I become more humble in the receiving that word of caution? So that is the challenge, I think. Thank you. Yes?
How do we productively show mercy and forgiveness and love to those who forward injustice, who betray the mission of our generation?
Yeah, that is a difficult one.
About 3 minutes as well.
South Africa had, so let's first start with, we had apartheid and then we had the elections. So we didn't have a Nuremberg trial. The people who were killing people were allowed to live in South Africa. And many of us were not happy. I was just born, so I didn't have consciousness really. But I heard of many of them weren't happy because the fact that people were they were the perpetrators of violent crimes, they were allowed to live and not be held accountable. They didn't go to court. So we did not have the Nuremberg trial, but we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the intention behind it, even though I think to some degree it has failed, the intention was not to do to them, the perpetrators, what they had done to us. To offer everyone an opportunity to be honest, to bring forth the truth, but to go on the way of reconciliation much more intensely, much more intentionally. And so the question of how we forgive, I think the most fundamental to that is to recognize the humanity of that person, those persons. To recognize that and I might be touching on this later, but to recognize that their human dignity does not stop because they committed a crime, a human rights violation. I say that even so, I know that today our problems in South Africa continue precisely because we didn't take seriously the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so I am with Jesus on this one, or at least from what the Gospels say. So you know how the tax collector goes to Jesus and asks for, I think his name is Zacchaeus, I don't know who it is, but the tax collector goes to Jesus and asks for forgiveness. And then Jesus says, yeah, sure, I'll forgive you. But go back to the people that you stole from and pay them 4 times over what you've stolen from them. So I'm with Jesus on this one. I think forgiveness should lead to reparations. If we are not materially showing our commitment to being forgiven, and this is the whole Oduyoyo notion of wholeness. Wholeness requires me to, I don't say pay back, but to repair the relationship that I have disrupted with my community. And so, yeah, so I'm not going to say to the museum in London to return the artifacts, but pay 4 times back what you've stolen. Does that help you? But I'm not a pacifist. I'm still struggling with that question. Nor am I Augustinian to say I believe in just war. I'm still figuring it out. But I do know that I don't want another Nuremberg trial. Yes?
Probably easier question, but is there any writings of or about any of those theologians you mentioned that are accessible to somebody who is just beginning to study theology?
I can link you up with them, yes. And if I forget, please come to me afterwards.
Thank you so much, Ashwin.